Hello, I am Lara Lillibridge, and I am a mentor with AWP Writer to Writer program. And I am excited to have three of my former mentees here today to have a conversation. And I just wanted to start by saying I got involved with Writer to Writer first after my first book came out, Girlish, Growing Up in a Lesbian Home. I really wanted to give back to the community. And as a queer person, I felt like there is just not enough resources for queer people. So I applied as a mentor, specifically looking to work with queer people or people of other underrepresented groups. And I also had, I think, mothers and a couple of other topics that were personal to me. They make the process so that you can really pick who you'd like to work with. And my first person that I worked with was Mika Todd, and that was 2019. And they were living in Spain at the time. And after that, my next was Ann, and Ann was my pandemic experience. We were working together when it hit and had to decide if we were going to brave on through, and we did. We powered through. Yeah. And then Robin, we just finished working together. So those and I will give each of you more of a, or let you guys each introduce yourselves more in a bit. So the first thing I want to start with is a reading. I think that's the best way to introduce who you are, is through your art and what you do. And I'm going to ask you to go in the order in which I worked with you. So I'm going to ask Mika to start. And if you want to give an introduction about yourself as well, how you came to Writer to Writer, that would be cool. Mika, I know you applied like 7 times, I think, before you were very persistent.
Well, I was actually looking back through my, the queue at the times that I had applied, and I had applied right out of undergrad. I had majored in sculpture, and it was probably the 3rd year that I sort of looked around and was like, this is not my hustle. Like, I know I'm going to have to hustle to be a maker, but this is just not where I'm going to be able to put my energy. And I had fallen in love with writing through my mentor, Harrison Candelaria Fletcher. And I applied to Writer in the midst of sort of being like destabilized, like where am I going to live? Like, do I want to stay in this city? Like, what job do I want to apply for? Anything like that. And I was rejected, but I got a really lovely personalized rejection from Diane Zena, I think. Zena was her name, who was working at the time. And it was that rejection, that personalized rejection, that kept me reapplying. And then when I finally was accepted, I wrote this email, and she was talking about how the person reading for me, I think it was Kathy, how excited she was that she was finally able to match me after so many seasons of applying. So yeah, that's how I got interested in AWP's program. Can definitely plug it that way. And then in terms of something to read, I just finished with my MFA in creative nonfiction at Colorado State University. And my thesis project is tentatively titled Constellations, because that is the form that it's sort of like a book-length lyric essay. Although a lot of people argue that I'm actually a poet. So, take it for what you will. So you can kind of see, if I get it close enough, if it's not going to blur it, that the cards get laid out in the order almost of constellations. And I'm not going to explain it too much, because hopefully the content will sort of start to give you an idea of what it is. But ideally, there's no like real order to it. I'm still kind of working that part out. But because of readings, I've sort of randomly selected some cards that I think might be good. I open my eyes, and before I can close them again, quick as a blink, before I expand my body just enough for the snap, crackle, pop of my back and ankles, before curling and uncurling my toes, rubbing my body against the ecstasy of the sheets, before pulling myself upright and then out of bed, before making coffee and sitting down to write or read or watch the squirrels, before all the things my mother would refer to as hatching, slowly pushing out of sleep's shell, before all of this, I open my eyes, the light hits, and something in my body says, begin. The story of how I almost did not make it into the world began on a Sunday when my mother was in church, when the light shone through the windows of St. John Lutheran as if God might have said, it's time. Or maybe he'd simply flipped a switch, as when he said, let there be light. Light shone through the windows and onto my mother's stomach as the Romantics might have portrayed Zeus, a golden shower over-enveloping. That Christian patriarch might have taken a page from Zeus, promiscuous, unfaithful, rapist, does not surprise me. Neither my conception nor birth were also violent, but neither was the latter easy. We keep artificial moons in our pockets, at our desks, in our living rooms. They push and pull us, the melatonin, the serotonin, the stimulus, fighting off sleep, allowing us to become creatures of the night. My mother went into labor early Sunday evening, September 6th. There was a lot of light, but no switches were flipped. Sometime after 1 a.m., in a room full of women laboring together, the woman in the bed next to my mother said something about a full moon. Science sheds disproven science for the newest version, the truer version, as close to true as we can get in the moment. It isn't perfect and doesn't pretend to be, when a fact is only a held breath. Partially, I knew at a young age that I was different beyond my own understanding. Not in those terms exactly, because I wasn't yet so self-reflective, didn't have the vocabulary or the reference points to navigate the how. Knowing astrology cannot be what it claims to be, I still look for the constellations, for the way science, religion, and the supernatural might still connect or intersect, for the links which cannot be explained into fact, but which cannot necessarily be explained away into fiction. There's always this tension between what if and what if. Before I moved to Europe, my best friend gave me a pendant of St. Christopher, patron saint of children and travelers, doubly fitting as I was traveling abroad to teach English that coming summer to a bunch of little Italian kids. I still wear the pendant not so much because I believe in St. Christopher proper, but because I believe in the power of the symbolism of my friend choosing that gift, partly for that very cultural history and association, but also because she chose that object in history with me in mind, a sincere desire for my safety manifest. God in the deist belief is not only the grand designer, the great creator, but also a mechanic, or perhaps a mad scientist. He sets up the world like 200,000 dominoes in a chain reaction, or an elaborate Rube Goldberg machine, and either steps back to watch or leaves the room entirely, perhaps uninterested in the end result of his creation. I've been searching for myself my whole life, through relationships, classes, cities, countries, religion, psychology, philosophy, television sagas, and daydreams. Should I stop there? I can keep going. That's the magic of this piece.
I think that's a wonderful place. I love that line. I've been searching for myself to all these places. Thank you for reading. So Ann, I had worked with you next. You were living in the East Coast at the time, if I recall correctly.
Yeah.
And sort of torn between essay and poetry. So I don't know what you are going to read for us today. But can you first tell us how you wound up working with Writer to Writer, how you heard about it, and then go ahead and read.
I think I heard about it through, one of the emailing newsletters or something. I have been getting poets and writers for years, although I haven't always been writing. I think at the point where I signed on to AWP mentor program was we had just moved to Rhode Island and from New York, and I wasn't working, and I've been a librarian for over 20 years. And I thought, well, here I am, in this place, and I haven't started looking for a job yet. I might as well do something with my writing and spend my time kind of productively. But it ended up being really kind of changed the way I was thinking about my writing, which, ended up being really great for me. Okay, so I was going to read. It's interesting because while I was in the program with Lara, I was doing creative nonfiction, and I had all these essays that we talked about, but I realized as we went along, my essays got shorter and they were fragmented. And, Lara said, have you ever written poetry? And I had actually, in my 20s, right after undergrad, I had gotten a master's, not an MFA, just a master's in creative writing with the emphasis on poetry. So then I really turned my focus onto poetry, although I entered into an MFA program, which I had to leave because my mother's ill and I just didn't have the time. While I was in that program, I started doing kind of prose poems that were very kind of creative nonfiction, but also poetic. And so I kind of melded the two, but I'm actually not reading that today. I'm going to read two poems I wrote, one last year and one 2021, I think. Okay, let me make this bigger. Snowdrops. Crying, yes, risk joy in the raw wind of the new world. Louise Gluck. Winter drags on, gasps its last heaving breath, and rolls into spring, like the end of a marathon, bodies collapsing almost in piles, and even the bystanders wonder if it was worth it. I have spent these months losing my mother to longer and longer gaps of time and knowing, and I am now in the phase where I'm more surprised when she knows where I live, when she knows I am married, when she knows I can't eat dairy, when she knows my father is her husband. As my mother forgets and forgets me, I wonder how I will recover who I am in this world. After all, I carry her name. Who will remember me and lead me through this blustery season? But the snowdrops, those wily winter blooms, white lanterns lighting the garden path, BFFs to Gloria the Snow, dwarf iris, and daffodil. Wind off the bay bends them into one another, and they huddle, hunkered down like the rest of us, until it ebbs and they lift their heads and spread their faces to the sky, alive and ready. In these last days of winter, I greet them, my personal cheerleaders, hear their whispered cheers in the breeze, and can't help but smile, breathe deep the salty air, and let it out slowly. Good morning, a mantra for the new world. All right, and then I'll read another one. This is called the Salt Marsh House. The realtor shows us a house at the edge of a salt marsh, despite our opposition to the flood zone and encroaching waters. As we walk up the driveway, I have already written it off. There isn't even a bay view to offset the precariousness, just a yard suspiciously soft and the faint lingering whiff of salt and fish and decaying seaweed. And then I see how watercolor sun washes the farmer's porch, and I begin to imagine myself sitting there, eyes closed, face lifted. It wouldn't be the first time the ocean healed me. I imagine a cup of coffee and the dog snoozing next to me, the light streaking in the window and spotlighting our grass green couch, with Anya's phone shoved between the cushions to be found later when supper is cooking on the dented gas stove and the shades are pulled against the day's last light, pink filtering in around the edges. In 30 years, the bay will be creeping up the front stairs, and we will be in our 80s. An osprey will nest atop our chimney. Cordgrass will overtake our couch. Fiddler crabs will dance across the kitchen countertop, across the dormant stove, and a great blue heron, perched at the end of our bed, will watch us sleep, watch the tide rise, and the earth would just take us. Ask us to return, and we will say yes.
That's beautiful. I love how the first is, so much about your mother, and then the second is sort of like your own ending.
Yeah.
But in a really beautiful way. And Robin, we just finished working together this, I guess, early summer, or I guess midsummer of 2023 for anyone who's watching not live. And you had been working on a memoir and essays and all sorts of things. So I have no idea what you'd like to read, but if you could talk first about how you came to writer, and then read for us, it would be great.
Sure. Yeah. And thank you for reading, Ann and Mika. Just so wonderful. Yeah, I found AWP through Instagram, actually. Lots of writers that I really loved were talking about going, and I just got excited about what AWP was, and I started, I looked it up, and then I signed up because I wanted to see some of the online programming that was available. So then I was a member, and then I was on the mailing list, and I got the information about Writer to Writer, and I think I got it like 2 days before it was due, but it looked so great that I just scrambled and like put aside everything else and thought really hard about like what I would want from it and what I could possibly how I would be a part of it, and like what the exchange would be, mentor to mentee, and it just felt like the right thing, and I sent it in, and here I am. So yeah, I feel incredibly lucky to be paired with Lara, and it's been wonderful. So yeah, I'm actually not reading from my memoir, although we did talk a lot about my memoir, and we worked quite a bit with it during the session. I'm actually going to read from an essay that takes place after the memoir, but it includes a lot of the same people, family members, and some of the time actually shifts back into memoir time, but this is like all information that probably won't be in the memoir, but it feels sort of adjacent. And so Lara has read the original one, but you haven't heard these new pieces. And so we had this discussion about, can it sit as it is, or there are these other things that I kind of want to explore, like it didn't feel quite complete. And so now I'm in the process of exploring those new pieces. So I'll be reading a couple new small pieces from the bigger essay. I think all you need to know is that, and this is content warning about suicide. So the whole piece in general deals with my stepmother's suicide. Her name is Martha, and I went back, I'm from Maine, and I went back to Maine to kind of help with everything after it happened. So helping with the house and all the belongings and what was happening with the family. And so these two little excerpts in particular are about Martha before, right? So just to get a more whole picture of her. So this first one takes place in the house in real time after everything happened. I tried to pull out and organize important items for Martha's immediate family, although they had been in shards for a while. Her father died when she was young. Her mother was ill and had passed a few years previously. There was one brother with an opaque thicket of quarrel between he and Martha that my barely grown-up self did not understand, and another brother literally off with the circus. When I was a teenager, we went to see that brother, a clown, at the fairgrounds. He gave me a huge hug and a grin, pulled off his sunglasses, and waved them around in the air. "Go take a look," he said. "It's okay, no one will mind." And he and Martha walked away while a tiger stopped me short. Hot orange in a red cage. Black stripes dripped over as if by glossy paint. All muscle and lethargy at once. The tiger hid from the sun in the corner, stared through me. Golden eyes of boredom and hurt. My feet leadened into the grass. I knew I could get closer, but didn't dare. A shroud of anger charged the space between us. The tiger blinked. Its tail flicked lightly 1, 2, 10, 20 into the dappled shadows by its rump. "What is your name?" I wanted to know. I felt like I could never leave, would just guard the space between us forever, when suddenly my body turned me on my heel and I walked away, magnets of orange at my back, tears in the corners of my eyes. In the car, Martha said, "He's in bad shape. I fear he will never get clean." I knew what high school messed up looked like and mapped this new version, adult messed up, across my image of her brother's face. If I hadn't known, I would have just said he looked tired but wired, in the way that small children can be both exhausted and wide awake, their eyes dark shiny dots of oblivion, their mouths unable to close properly. Well, he's never going to help himself, so there's nothing I can do. She sighed and stared out the windshield at the non-existent main traffic. And then this is in 2000. So again, before everything happened and before Martha also developed trigeminal neuralgia in 2001, 2002. So this is before that. Before the pain, when my stepmother appeared on Jeopardy in 2000, I didn't get to watch it until I visited later in the year, and we played the videotape in the living room. On screen, Martha's eyes seemed to almost disappear into the glint of the lights on the show. She squinted and smashed her lips into a split-second thin line whenever she pressed her buzzer. In the living room, she said, "My buzzer wouldn't work, or the other two were faster or something. I thought I was pressing it right when they gave us the light to do it. The other two kept taking all the answers I knew away from me." I could see on the TV screen her arm muscles tensing, her hand with the buzzer lifting, the other contestants winning the draw. Normally, Martha killed it at Jeopardy, hollering the responses out to every clue in the proper form before my brain could process the backwardness of an answer that needed a question. She was almost always faster than the contestants on the screen. "What is the Fifth Amendment? Who is Ralph Nader? What is value-added tax?" In the actual studio, most of the clues she got were very low value. "What is the Drew Carey Show? What are fascists?" "Your father taught me well," she said in the living room. And then the one that made her smirk at the live studio audience as a sexual harassment lawyer, Alex Trebek. It won for General Excellence in 1989, the year of its 25th anniversary swimsuit issue. Coincidence? My stepmother, both snide and charming. What is Sports Illustrated? During the think music of Final Jeopardy, the Rottweilers sang their howling song, stopping right at the end with the 2 drum beats. To keep Martha from talking about how she failed in the final round, I asked, "Did you think about the dogs singing when you were writing out your question?" Thank you.
Thank you for reading. And that was very interesting for me because I hadn't heard them, and they were things that we were talking about, what she was like before. So that's really interesting. One thing about the program that I think is interesting is that as a mentor, we apply to AWP, and then they go through and sort all the applications, and then we give them sort of our wish list of what topics we're interested in someone working on or what kind of a writer. And then they send us 5 applicants, and then we write back with our top 2 and just like cross our fingers and hope. And I was able to get all 3 of you were my first choice mentees, which I was very excited about. And at the beginning they would, and I don't think they did this with Robin, but with Ann and Mika, I had to submit a writing sample to send to the potential mentee to see if they, liked me back, basically. And I think that's one of the things that's different about being a mentor versus like teaching a class, is that it is sort of like a more experienced writer and a less experienced writer, but there's more of an equality in the relationships. And I know that I learned a lot from all 3 of you and everyone I've worked with. And one of the things that was unique for me was, I said I applied when Girlish had first come out, which was about growing up with lesbian parents. And I had never had a critique partner that was queer or an editor that was queer. In fact, Writer to Writer was the first place that I actually had writing conversations with other queer writers, which is really exciting for me. And so I wanted to just sort of start, and again, in the order of Mika, Ann, and then Robin, of, working with queer versus straight or not queer writers, or just something about that kind of process. I know for me, I found myself in books, often in other marginalized writers that were not queer, because I think there's a lot of commonality in the marginalized experience. But anyway, Mika, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was thinking about what it means to write for a particular audience and thinking about queerness in that way. And I think it was the 2018 Best American Short Stories that Roxane Gay edited. And she was talking about this question of like, when people ask her about her intersectional identities and what that does for her writing, I think her answer was something along the lines of like, I don't sit down to write necessarily for like this one type of person who maybe is going to like understand my type of like oppression or experience, but that it infuses pretty much everything that she writes about, because everything has to pass through her as a kind of like filter. And so I was thinking a lot about that, at least in terms of my recent, like the last, I think probably year and a half, when I first started working with Lara and applying to grad schools. Those were very close together. I was working on samples while I was working with Lara, and at that point, I was really focusing on my queer experience, and I was writing just like very directly about the kind of treatment that I received growing up, through even up to when I was working with Lara and experiencing slurs and stuff on the street. And it does make a difference when someone is able to tap into that experience in terms of, I think, workshopping. When I was in undergrad and working with Harrison for the first time, I think it was him who was kind of like, if you get like 10 to 20% of good feedback from a workshop on a piece, like you're doing pretty well, because as Lara's kind of saying, like you don't always have the people who are either coming from that place or maybe don't have this sort of like even like frame of reference to give you that kind of feedback. So I guess maybe to circle back, like I don't right now, I'm not actively thinking about queerness as I'm making, but I do think that it has been foundational, beginning with Lara and then being able to work with so many queer people during my program. It's almost now like a muscle that I don't have to think about. That's probably not the right way to say it, but it feels a lot more intuitive, I think, because I had that exposure.
That's great. And I remember with you and I had some conversations at one point, and you don't have to talk about this, but I was just thinking as I look at your face, about, like stereotypes and not wanting to feed into queer stereotypes. And for me, when we were writing about our personal experiences, and for me, it was the first time I had had someone that understood intimately what I was talking about, in terms of feeling a pressure to represent the queer community well, or to sort of be on guard against judgment, or so I don't know. So for me, it was very very special to be able to have those conversations with you. Yeah. Now I will let you talk.
Yeah, I agree. I was trying to think, like, I think you're probably the first queer writer that I've ever worked closely with. Like maybe there was someone else in a random workshop or something. I really don't remember. But it's interesting because when I got into the MFA program, there were other queer people in the program, and I noticed, I also had a big age difference of my peers in the MFA program. So I kind of had two things that I wasn't like hyper aware of, but a little bit aware of. And, some of my poetry deals with sex or, passages about like things I've experienced or whatever. And it was interesting because there was a queer person that I befriended, and we would debrief after workshop, kind of go over what people said about our stuff and shore each other up. Like, because there's definitely, I don't necessarily write just for queer people, but obviously, I have experienced a queer experience. And when I'm writing about my life, it is the queer one version of a queer experience in the United States. And sometimes I think that there is some misunderstanding with cisgender straight people. But I get that. And I do feel like that's how we learn about people that are different from us, is just reading experience. To speak about what Lara had said, yes, I was concerned about, like, there are things I feel like as queer people, and maybe this is just because of my age, I'm not sure, but like, we kind of hide is a bad word, but kind of keep too close because it might feed into a stereotype, or it might be used as evidence of why people are gay or whatever. Like, just like, don't even want to go down those roads. But that's I think it's been really a joyful experience working with Lara and some of the folks at UMass Boston, where I was in the MFA program, like kind of having open discussions about our queer lives and how they affect our writing, and honestly a queer aesthetic. Like my last semester at UMass Boston, we got to work with Chen Chen. So it was fantastic. It was like queer teacher, queer kids in the class. Like it was really a growth experience for me.
And Robin, one thing that comes to mind with your project is how it is not a coming out story, but it's a queer story. In fact, none of you were, at least when I was working with you, working on a coming out story, which seems to be like the most common kind of queer story published, and is important. I mean, absolutely, it's important, but just sort of like, yes, I am writing this and I happen to be queer, and this was my life, but it's not all of my life. Yeah. So anyway, Robin, I wanted to let you have a chance to talk about working with queer writers or writing while queer.
Yeah, sure. I've had both experiences of being in very not queer, cis, heteronormative writing groups where I'm the only queer person. And now recently I'm having the experience of being in a workshop where everyone is queer. Not only that, like half the people are trans, and it's such a different experience. I think they're both valuable in certain ways. I feel like like me personally, so I'm pan. I came out in my sort of mid-20s. But I had this experience where my mom was like, "Oh, I thought you already were gay." Like I've kind of crossed boundaries my whole life. And I feel like I exist in this bizarre position where queer people look at me and think that I'm queer, and straight people look at me and think that I'm straight. And I get treated that way depending on who's looking at me. And then even when straight people know I'm queer, they still sort of treat me like I'm straight. And it's a very fascinating position to be in, where I'm not trying to be a chameleon, but somehow I end up being almost like this chameleon. And I feel like my writing is a little bit like that too, where I'm so in my memoir, you know, I'm telling this story that has more to do with like me and my father, and some sort of neurological stuff that was happening with me over the course of my life. And there are parts where it's very clear that I'm becoming more queer, but that's not, as Lara said, like that's not the main idea of the book. And where I feel like the queerness in that writing lies more is that I'm not trying to tell a sort of patriarchal, like hero's journey sort of form story. And I think that's also very like queer writing and more diverse writing, people writing from other countries or with different backgrounds, like that sort of hero's journey story is just one way of telling a story, and there's so many other ways of writing and sharing ideas, and so I feel like that is sort of where I'm living more in that space of using words differently, of hopefully I can be in this position where different audiences will be drawn just to like the work itself, and it doesn't have to be, you know, I like, who knows what's going to happen, but it doesn't have to be like a fully queer story for queer people to want to read it, and it doesn't have to be a fully straight story for straight people to want to read it. I just want it to be the story it is, and if people like the writing and they get pulled in, like that's what I want. I feel like it's almost like taking it to a place, I mean, I hope taking it to a place where I don't know that I have the right words for this, but the story doesn't have to be about queerness itself for people to get a greater picture of what queerness can be in the world, and to sort of open their own view of how everything is ultimately on this spectrum. And not only is it on the spectrum, like everything ultimately moves around the spectrum and nothing is fixed. And I would love to like put that more out into the world. Right. I mean, that said, I tend to get more valuable feedback from people who are queer, I think, because there's already, like, we've been sort of forced to see things like from all these different angles just by how we've grown up and come into the world. So yeah, it's an interesting topic.
Well, that's interesting. I was at a virtual AWP during the pandemic, and it was a trans writers panel, and someone said, I wish I remember who, that as a queer person, the idea that everything that you do is queer, that everything you do, everything that you write. And for me, that's not been true in terms of my first experience. I mean, my mother and her wife got together when I was 3. So I grew up in a lesbian family at a time when it wasn't safe. So I grew up very hidden, always pretending to be straight, always pretending my parents were straight, always lying and masking. I think masking is the best word. And another one of my mentees, JP, read an essay I wrote, and they said, this is great, but no one would know you were queer from reading it, because I was so used to translating everything for a straight audience. And I think it wasn't until I started to identify myself as a queer writer, not just a writer, that I sort of tapped into a different kind of honesty and wildness. So Mika, I am going to throw that at you about, is everything that you write queer, or, do you mask, or what do you think about that?
So I definitely, I agree. I think queerness is almost, well, if you're thinking about like covering mainstream versus like the niche or the like things that maybe don't get as much spotlight time, I think queerness is kind of an undertone, even if it's not foregrounded. And I say that in a sense of like, if you are in any way kind of infusing queerness, whether it's just from like your particular perspective, I think your work can speak to the queerness in others that they either do or maybe less conscious of. Which is to say, if you're addressing queerness directly, but then I think even if, as you guys are kind of saying, it's not the thing in the spotlight, that queerness is still going to kind of color the experience, and it doesn't have to be the subject matter to contain those elements. And I think in terms of my work, specifically ways that queerness is currently manifesting is in a challenge to genre. I said earlier that I majored in sculpture, and when I dedicated myself to writing after undergrad, I kind of thought that I had to make a choice and that I was leaving that practice behind. And then I kind of went in this circle where I was like, I'm a writer, I'm a writer, I'm a writer. And then I like came back and there was this wall. And during the program, I broke through the wall, and it was my previous practice that was now meeting my writing practice. And so a lot of my stuff is kind of like my thesis, or at least stuff I'm working on now, where it's not just something you sit with as a book. And even as a book, if you guys have heard of Sarah Miner, she's one of my biggest inspirations right now. And her collection, Bright Archive, really forces you to like turn it around and like read it in different directions. There's a broadside that falls out and is like Lincoln logs stacked. And so I'm thinking about queerness in that way too, because genre and gender are very, very, they come from the same roots. And I'm thinking now about the bending genre anthology and Cosmology, and just that like there are so many opportunities in terms of mixing genre or evolving into new genres, especially based on technology and culture, how those things will never stop changing with us. So why should the work we make? So I'm trying to find ways to, I guess, kind of leave the page and make it a lot more about the viewer and the body. One of my committee members during my defense was like, you're working with the body more than anything else with all of this. And I was like, oh, yes, that's right. I want to be aware of whoever is holding this. But that queerness, they're going to encounter it either way, regardless of their identity.
Thanks. And Anne, you know, it's interesting because the pieces that you read, they could be prose poems, they could be flash, non-creative nonfiction. I mean, you are also sort of blurring the genre in terms of your writing with those. And with your essays, they were so lyrical and, you know, sometimes fragmented. And, you know, do you think that queerness affects how we make art, or not necessarily?
I don't know, because I don't know what it's like not to be queer. But you know, it's interesting because when I was in school last year, last year, no, I guess it was the year before, in Chen's class, we had to create our own form, you know, from nothing. And I created a form that I called the Abbot, which was named after the person who came up with what a card catalog looks like and how it's organized on the little 3x5 card. A person actually came up with what goes where. And so I named it after that person, and it has a visual component to it, and that it kind of feels like a 3x5 card. But I do agree with Mika that I've been definitely kind of working with queering the genre. I have this vision of creating some sort of space or evoke like a feeling or a sensation. And while I'm doing that with words, I feel like there's another component. And like I'm a quilter, I work in wood, I do a lot of fine art, you know, like painting and stuff. And I actually consulted with this young woman. She has an MFA in like fiber arts or something. She owns the quilt shop near my town. And I was telling her what I wanted, and I was like, I want, you know, because I was at, how would I mount this? Like I created this, I don't know, it's like this, and it has a fragment of a poem on it, and it's all in grays. And I was like, how would I show this as a piece of art, you know? And so we were kind of talking about it, and she's like, well, you could do this and hang it on the wall. And I was like, no, I want people to walk through it. Like, I want there to be like a dozen of these, and I want them to walk through it. And like, yeah, then, you know, you could take away the written words, but like, I want it to be an experience. I don't know if that's queer or not, but that's what I've been thinking about lately.
That is really cool. I would love to see that. And Robin, you know, when everyone's talking about their different arts, you are also a musician, which is very present in your writing. And I don't know, do you know, how do you feel about queering genres or queering art?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately what I love to do is just not worry about expected outlines or structures, and just do a little bit like what Anne was saying, just go into a space where I'm playing with words and sounds and feeling, and just letting it come out and working with it almost like sculpture, like giving it some time, coming back to it, playing with it. How does it sound? How does it feel? What does it evoke? So it feels more almost like flow state. I really am a big fan of working creatively in flow state, or doing a lot of things in flow state. And yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's funny that you mentioned the music, because when I was in my first band ever, I was in it for 10 years, and we were all queer, and it was like the 90s in through the mid 2000s. And we would have discussions about this all the time, because all of us were queer, and we were writing and singing about queer things because we were queer, but we weren't actually trying to be a queer band. And that distinction was always so tricky, because we understood what we meant and how it felt to just create art the way we wanted to create art. And then how strange it would be, because people wouldn't know where to place us, because they couldn't really place us in the straight alternative music world, which was kind of where we belonged, like musically. So they would sort of push us into, and no shade to Riot Girl, but they would push us into the Riot Girl genre, because that's what they thought maybe we fit into, even though we did not. So it was always like we would just defer to like what we wanted to do. We never tried to sound like anyone in particular, or, play up to any particular like look or whatever. We were just ourselves. But it was such a lesson in how, even though you can be very clear about where you're coming from and what you're doing, you can't control how people outside are seeing that, or what they're doing with that, or how they're trying to categorize that, or where they want to put it. And so, I'm not really up to the point of selling my manuscript, but that is somewhere in the back of my mind of like, I know what I feel like my audience is, but I feel like unless I'm working with queer editors, or I don't know, maybe this isn't true, but I think there's a chance that that same kind of thing will happen, where it gets put into a pigeonhole where maybe it doesn't quite belong, but that's the place that people can sort of make sense of it. So I don't know. I'm all for pushing boundaries and not doing things by rote, or like not doing things the way that people expect. But I also know that then creates, like, sometimes people don't know what to do with that. So yeah, it's complicated.
It's true. I feel like a lot of times publishing is very different from creating art, and publishing can often be about, how do I sell this? When we're creating, it's about how am I expressing this? And that is just one benefit of small presses and independent presses, I think. But unfortunately, we are about out of time here. Does anyone have a last thought they want to get in? I think Mika's frozen, so, oh, you're back. Before we leave, Mika, Ann, and Robin, do any of you have anything you want to add before we're completely out of time?
I can just say I thought the program was really wonderful, and I'm so happy I got to participate, and I feel like it's just making such great connections and strides forward in my work and how I think about my work and where I'm going. And so it's been really, really wonderful.
For me also. And thank you all. And it was fun for me to have the three of you in a virtual room together. And maybe we will, meet in person at an AWP coming up.
I will be there. Kansas City.
Yes, I will too. For sure.
Me too.
Oh my gosh.
Yay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lara.
Yes. Thank you guys. It was really lovely to talk with all of you.
It was. Thank you all.